Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another reading vlog. It feels like a little while since I've sat down to film. It's only been a couple of weeks, but Tyler and I had a lot of traveling plans during October, and the month kind of got away from me. But today I am back for a very exciting video, which is, of course, the last video in my Reading the National Book Award for Fiction list series. Um, and I will, of course, be reading the much anticipated, much loved James. So I have already done reading vlogs about all fours, my friends, Martyr, and Ghost Roots. I will link them here if you're interested in seeing all of my detailed thoughts about them. But while I loved each of those books for different reasons, none of them rose quite to the level of a 5-star or one of my absolute favorite books of all time. And so I'm really hoping that this week, reading perhaps the most talked about of the bunch, the most favored to win the prize, James, maybe, just maybe, I will find a new 5-star read, which would be very exciting. I did get the paperback copy. I'm not actually sure. I think this might be the British cover. The American one is black and just has the word James in yellow on the front of it. But I enjoy this cover, and I enjoy paperback much better than hardback. So here we are. Before I talk about James, I did want to talk about something that is very new in my reading life and that has kind of revolutionized things for me. And that is annotating books, which I probably am a little slow on the uptake. I know there are, of course, many readers that love to annotate, tab, all of the good things. But growing up as the daughter of a librarian, I've always had this anxiety about writing in a book. I grew up with a lot of library books. But since I do have this collection behind me, it only felt right to have a discourse with what I read and, really pick out things and see what I like and what resonates with me. And so I annotated my very first book, which was The Lion Women of Tehran by Marjan Kamali. I might talk about this in a recent reads video. Let me know if you're interested in hearing my thoughts. But I tabbed this one. I wrote about it. I wrote all over the book. I have a legend with my tabs. And so this was definitely a new reading experience. And I really think enhanced how I read the book and enhanced my thoughts of the book. And so today in this vlog, I'm going to be, of course, reading James, but also annotating James in hopes that it will also do a similar thing of enhancing my thoughts or maybe letting me or enabling me to find things that perhaps I wouldn't have. Whenever I'm annotating, I always find it difficult to know what things to tab, what to include in my tab legend. I don't know if that's a annotator's problem or just a newbie annotator's problem. But so far I have quotes, character info, and humor. But I'm sure I will have many more things that stand out to me that I want to tab. Anyways, I have rambled a lot at the beginning of this video. This book, so far, I am on about page 33. And so far, there's just so much in here that is jumping out at me that I've highlighted, underlined. Oh, by the way, in case you guys are interested, I annotate with this specific pen. I will link it down below, and the Tombow highlighters, which I think are quite popular among people that annotate in the booktube community. But if you're curious, I'll link that stuff down below. So this book is a reimagining of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. If the story was told not just from the perspective of James, but by James, or Jim as he's known as in the original novel, a slave who adventures with this young boy named Huck. Don't want to give too many spoilers away, but it's really the story about his life, his story. And I am just loving kind of the interplay so far between dark humor, irony, sadness. I wanted to just read the very beginning of this book, the opening of this book, which I thought was particularly beautiful and poignant. So here we go. Those little bastards were hiding out there in the tall grass. The moon was not quite full, but bright, and it was behind them so I could see them as plain as day, though it was deep night. Lightning bugs flashed against the black canvas. I waited at Miss Watson's kitchen door, rocked a loose step board with my foot, knew she was going to tell me to fix it tomorrow. I was waiting there for her to give me a pan of cornbread that she made with my Sadie's recipe. Waiting is part of a slave's life, waiting and waiting to wait some more, waiting for demands, waiting for food, waiting for the ends of days, waiting for the just and deserved Christian reward at the end of it all. What a beginning to a story. Some of the other things that have really stood out to me so far is the way that language is used in this story. So James speaks in a different way or a different dialect, I should say, when he is around his masters, white people, than when he's just with his family. And it's kind of all about survival, honestly, making white people see him in a certain way and think a certain way about him. But as this is his story that he writes, it really, you get to see kind of the depths of that, the reasons for that. And obviously, Huckleberry Finn, although I have not read the novel, you see it from an outside perspective. So of course, you wouldn't know all that depth, the strive for survival that Huck sees, who is the, I believe, protagonist of Huckleberry Finn. Having said that, I don't believe, need to read Huckleberry Finn to enjoy this novel. I do think that there are, of course, a lot of nods to it. Perhaps your reading experience might be a little bit enhanced, but I think you could thoroughly enjoy it as I have been, just reading it as it is. So anyways, I have some errands to run. I need to go to Sephora and get a couple of things that I've run out of, mainly like some skincare stuff. So I'm going to do that. I want to organize a few things around the house. I'm going to play a little bit of piano today. I've been having a few tough mental health days in the setting of the American election. Not going to talk about it too much here, but it has been just a lot to grapple with. So I'm trying to do things that I love and that I enjoy and that bring me happiness. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. And then, of course, getting to read a little bit more of James later. So it's a few days later, and I wanted to chat a little bit more in depth of some of my initial thoughts about James. We are having ourselves a very rainy day here, so it has been a day where I'm making a grocery list for chicken noodle soup and just laying on the couch and reading. As you can see by my annotations, I've made it through the halfway point of this book, although I still do have quite a bit to get through. And as I was rewatching the last clip that I filmed, I realized that I talked in generalities about a lot of things, but not too many specifics. Obviously, spoiler-free specifics about the actual setup of this book and how things are progressing so far. So the main structure of this book follows a young boy named Huck and a slave named Jim. They meet because Huck is living with Miss Watson and Jim is one of Miss Watson's slaves. And so they kind of initially connect and know each other through that. And they each have very compelling reasons to want to get out of there. Huck has been abused by his father before, and his father is now back in the picture. And so he wants to very much get out of Dodge and not be around that situation anymore. And Jim learns that he is most likely going to be separated from his family forever, his family being his wife and daughter, because Miss Watson wants to sell Jim to another plantation. And so Jim ends up running away, kind of hooking up with Huck, and they go on an adventure trying to escape this bad situation together. Obviously, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is told from the perspective of Huck and more surrounding his story. But this story is really grounded in Jim, also known as James, telling his own story. You find out pretty early on that James is in fact writing this story, and he is not the slave that he is written as in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, very like good-natured and unaware. In fact, he is incredibly educated, literate man who has a broad lexicon and knowledge about philosophers, the history of slavery, and such. That initial passage that I read to you guys in the previous clip kind of shows that while Huck is playing around with Tom Sawyer, and in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, they think that James is not aware of kind of the games that they're playing on him. In fact, James is very much aware, very cognizant of how he is being treated and how he is being seen by these boys, and very much kind of manipulating the situation in order to essentially stay safe. Much of his story, he is essentially code switching, speaking in a language called slave, or a different dialect, so that white people think of him a certain way. But in fact, he very much knows standard English, but is kind of protecting himself by essentially pretending that he doesn't, and making his owners or white people in general think about him a certain way. And so you really follow James and Huck as they float down a river trying to escape this bad situation. A lot of the kind of situations that they find themselves in are very much based on The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I know that because I looked at some of the plot synopsis, although have not read the book myself, but also because The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is not told from Jim's perspective. Percival Everett gets to embellish and kind of imagine what Jim was doing during certain parts of the story where Huck and Jim are separated. And in a lot of those parts of the story, we get kind of that richness that, yes, a retelling of a classic American novel, but also but also becoming a classic in itself, where Percival Everett kind of gets to take the story in the way that he wants. I do love how fast-paced the plot is. The chapters are extremely short. You're going from one scene to the next, one challenge to the next. I think is probably reminiscent of Huck Finn based on the length of that book and the amount of stuff that's in this that's also in Huck Finn, but certainly very readable and plotty novel, which I have heard just gets even more plotty towards the end, as I've heard that there is a lot crammed into the last 100 pages. I think one of the most unique parts, or one of the parts of this book that is really highlighted, maybe in a way that Huck Finn didn't highlight it, is the power of language. James being able to write his own story. In fact, this whole book is essentially written by James, shows that while through a lot of his life, he's having to use language to stay safe, pretending that he's illiterate, pretending that he doesn't understand standard English. He, in fact, is able to subvert that situation by paving his own way, finding his own story. But it's not one that comes without peril or without danger. In fact, in one part of the story, he gets a pencil. I won't go into that, but that moment he finds like such comfort and such joy in having a tool where he can finally express himself. But with that comes an intense amount of danger and harm, not only to him, but also to other people in the story. Another thing that I touched on a little bit earlier is the way that irony and satire are used in this book, which I think is just genius. While this book is obviously has a lot of very incredibly harrowing scenes, overall is telling a horrifying story, there is this dryness, this sarcasm that runs throughout the story. You can't help but laugh at certain situations, which I think not necessarily brings levity, but brings a nice balance. And also, humor, I think, is a really effective way to make a point, to make a scene more impactful. Having that emotional reaction, while it might not be one that you would associate with such a tragic event, can be really eye-opening and really memorable. And so I have loved so many scenes where humor is tied into it. not only humor, but there's a lot of moments of dramatic irony, of just ridiculousness that really kind of challenge and build upon a lot of the initial principles in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. At one part in the story, James actually ends up as a group of the Virginia minstrels. They were a group that performed in blackface and entertained white people. And essentially, he was called to be part of the group because one day one of the members heard his voice. Another way that language is kind of brought into this, he was sought out because of his beautiful singing voice. But obviously, the people in this minstrel group are in fact white performing in blackface, but Jim actually is black. And so there's this whole ridiculous situation of him posing as a white person in blackface so that he can be kind of part of this group and be used by these people. There's this there's this quote that I loved on page 170 where he says, "Never had a situation felt so absurd, surreal, and ridiculous. And I had spent my life as a slave. There we were, 12 of us, marching down the main street that separated the free side of town from the slave side. 10 white men in blackface and one black man passing for white and painted black, and me, a light brown black man painted black in a way to appear like a white man trying to pass for black. The storefronts, a bank and a store and such, all looked flat and without depth, like I could just kick them over. It occurred to me that there was no telling which side was free and which side was slave. Then I understood that it didn't really matter." And I feel that that in itself, while kind of ironic and ridiculous, is so effective at making his point. Throughout the book, Jim also grapples a lot with the history of slavery. He, in fact, is interested in philosophy himself, which I think is probably part of the story because I think Percival Everett he studied philosophy at some point in his life. And so Jim kind of imagines what would Voltaire and John Locke say about slavery, what would their views be? And he has this discourse and kind of chats back and forth with them, challenging their thoughts, but also, bringing these philosophers and these ideas about slavery from the time into the novel, which I think was very effective and accessible. Sometimes when you're bringing, philosophers into something, not every reader is going to be familiar with what that philosopher might have believed. But I think the way that it's done here shows both the way that James is incredibly educated and thoughtful, not how he is written in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but also discusses a lot of kind of the philosophy of slavery of the time and really has that interesting conversation. I am certainly loving this book, as you guys can probably tell. I have nothing negative to say about it so far. I've just been mulling over it, reading reviews, and just thoroughly enjoying it. So I have about 100 pages to finish up for today, which I'm very much looking forward to. I'm going to go to the shop and buy some stuff to make chicken noodle soup and just have a comforting night reading and eating, and then going to work, unfortunately, overnight tonight. But hoping to finish this up today, as it has been quite a lovely treat. So Tyler and I just got back from a very autumnal game of pickleball, which he won handedly. Although I will say it was my very first game ever. So, I'm going to give myself some grace. It was very fun to be outside in the cold weather. It was fun to finally feel the changing of the season, which has been quite absent this year up to this point. And I'm very glad to say that I have finished James by Percival Everett, which I gave a resounding 5 stars. I just loved almost everything about this book. I found the plot propulsive. I found the theme of language, which I kind of chatted about in the last clip, to just be so well fleshed out in this book. I found it to be humorous and really just enjoyable to read. And I think it was for sure my favorite book on the list. I think, for me to love a book, while I am definitely a character driven reader, and we did have a wonderful central character of James, I also do have to relate to the plot and find a plot that moves me, that I'm excited to come back to and come back to. And I feel like of all the books, this one had the most tight plot. And I think this is the one that will just stick with me for the longest. If you guys are curious what my final annotation things that I was looking for were for this book, it was just quotes, character info, humor, and philosophy. And I think that those were certainly all very central things to this fantastic book. So, with that, we have reached the end of the National Book Award for Fiction vlogs, and it is now time to say my personal pick, which is probably not going to be a surprise to anybody, as well as who I think is actually going to win the prize. These were all of the finalists, all of which I gave 4 stars, except for James, which I gave 5 stars. So it is pretty clear that James is the one that I want to win. And I think this is the one that I think will win if I had to guess. However, there's one other book on this list that I think could win and I wouldn't be surprised. And that is All Fours by Miranda July. I just think that this has a lot of groundbreaking, really important ideas in it. And I could see the National Book Award wanting to elevate those. And also, it's a fantastic book on its own right, not just what it's talking about, but the way it's written and the art of this book is incredible. But I do have to say, I want James to win, and I think James is going to win. So if you are interested to see who is going to actually win the National Book Award for Fiction finalists, you can tune in on the 20th of November, I believe, and see if I'm right or if another book surprises us. And thank you so much for everybody who joined in for this adventure that I've done many times now and is always just such a treat for me to come back to. Let me know what your favorite was, which you want to win the ultimate prize. And I will see you guys very soon with another video. Bye.